Hey guys, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about ER and IR verbs. So you may remember that we have talked about verbs that end in the letters AR already. So in Spanish, you have to remember that there are a total of 3 types of verbs. The first one being AR verbs, which we've already talked about. And then we have verbs that end in the letters ER, and then we have verbs that end in IR. So today we're going to be talking about ER and IR verbs together because they're kind of similar, okay? But first it's important that we review our AR verbs, okay? So las terminaciones de los verbos AR, right? So the endings for AR verbs are o, as, a, amos, ais, and an. Remember that we use o if we're talking about ourselves, so the yo form. We use as if we're talking about the tú form, which is our informal you. And then we use a if we're talking about él, ella, usted, or one single person, he, she, or formal you. Moving over to the plural side, we would use amos if we're talking about nosotros, or if our sentence says somebody y yo, that's going to also be amos. For vosotros, which remember means y'all in English, would be ice. Okay, so we'll use ice if we're talking about vosotros, or if we're talking about somebody y tú. And then last but not least, we have an, which we would use for ellos, ellas, ustedes, or they, or you all plural. So in order to conjugate our ER or our IR verbs, we're going to follow the same process that we do when we conjugate AR verbs. So just to refresh our memory on that process, the first thing that we have to do is we have to identify our subject. Okay, so we have to find out who is the person or the thing doing the action. Okay, and then the next thing that we have to do is drop the ending. So no matter which verb we're working with, we're either going to drop AR, we're going to drop ER, or we're going to drop IR. After we've done that, we bring down the stem, or the part that's left. So if we're talking about maybe an AR verb that we already know, we have hablar, and we would drop the AR, which would leave us with hable, and that's what we're going to bring down. That is known as our stem. And then very last step is we're going to add in the new ending. So once again, using our verb hablar is an example for us. The yo form is, or we'll pretend that we're working with the subject yo, right? We know that our yo ending is o, so identify subject, yo. Drop the ending of hablar, we would drop the AR. Bring down the stem, we would be left with hable, and then add our new ending, which is just an O. That would give us yo hablo, right? So we would follow that exact same process no matter what verb we're working with. But in order to be able to follow that process, we need to know what our endings are going to be for ER verbs and for IR verbs. So here we have our ER verb endings, and we also have our IR verb endings. First, we're going to talk about our ER verb endings, which are these ones over here on the left-hand side. Our yo ending is going to be o, so you'll notice that's the same as it was for our AR verbs. Our tú ending is going to be es. Our él, ella, usted ending is going to be e. Our nosotros ending is going to be hemos. Vosotros is going to be es. And then our ellos, ellas, ustedes form is going to be en. So once again, for ER verbs on this left-hand side, we have o, es, e, hemos, es, en. Make sure you're pronouncing this with a softer sound. So e is going to be the sound, right? Es, e, hemos, this is where it becomes important. Es, and then en. Moving over to the right-hand side, these are our endings for verbs that end in IR. So we're going to have o, es, e, imos, is, en. Okay, so once again, that was o, es, e, imos, is, en. You'll notice that we have a lot of similarity between our ER and our IR verbs. After you've written down your chart, it would be a good idea for you to draw the same shape that you see me drawing on your screen. You might want to draw it a little nicer, but you get the idea. This shape is what we call a boot. Okay, it will become more important for us as we move through the semester, but just know that this boot is going to be something helpful for us. Now, if we're comparing our ER verbs over here on the on the left-hand side to our IR verbs over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice that they are similar or the same inside of our boot, right? So inside of the boot, we have O, es, and then e followed by n. For both verbs, it is the exact same inside the boot. Outside of the boot is where it's a little bit different. So for ER verbs outside of the boot, we have hemos and es. For IR verbs outside of the boot, we have imos and is. So it's very important that although these follow very similar patterns, that these forms here are is, are imos, amos, and es, that these are different, okay? So keep in mind that for the two verbs, those are different. We can only use amos if we're talking about the nosotros form of an ER verb. We can only use es if we're talking about the vosotros form of an ER verb. The same way that these over here on the right, emos and is, are only for IR verbs. Okay, so please make sure that you either highlight those different forms or maybe put a star next to them like I did, so that those stand out to you. And also make sure that you draw this boot on your chart so that you can see the similarities between the verbs. So, we had the pattern for our AR verbs, way of conjugating. We've got patterns obviously here for our ER and IR verbs. These are two examples that we're going to go over so that you can really see everything come together. We're going to start over here with the verb escribir, which means to write. Escribir, a way you can kind of remember this verb is that a scribe is a person who does the writing. So escribir and scribe, they look and sound similar, and they do kind of have the same meaning, okay? So our first step, if we were trying to conjugate this, would be to find out our subject. Obviously, our chart already has the subjects in it, so that's kind of done for us. Our next step would be to take off our ending. So in this case, it's an IR verb, so I mark off the IR. And then I'm left with my stem, escribe, which I bring down here. It's the part that's not underlined. Okay, so you can see that I have escribe for everything. And then my final form would be to plug in my ending. So it would be o, es, e, imos, is, en, which would give me for all of my forms, I would have yo escribo, tú escribes, él, ella, usted escribe, nosotros escribimos, vosotros escribís, and then ellos, ellas, ustedes escriben. So that would be our conjugation for the verb escribir. Okay, so following the exact same process that we already talked about for AR verbs, and then just applying our IR endings. Now let's see what this looks like with an ER verb. So now we're going to look at comer. Comer means to eat. Okay, so you'll notice it's an ER verb. So I would take off my ER or take off my ending just like I did for my IR verb and for my AR verbs earlier. And then we see that my stem is com, right? So you'll notice that every single one of my forms here has com in it. And then I would plug in my endings. O, es, e, hemos, es, en, which would give me yo como, tú comes, él, ella, usted comen, nosotros comemos, vosotros coméis, ellos, ellas, ustedes comen. So once again, you'll notice that I plugged in only ER endings because this was an ER verb. I cannot plug in IR endings or AR endings because this is an ER verb. So I must use ER endings. The pattern is the same, okay? The steps that I take are going to be the same, but I have to use the appropriate endings. All right, and then this is just going to be a little helpful trick for you, okay? Because accents, we've already talked about how important they are, right? It makes a difference of what the word means. It's also there to help us properly pronounce the different words. So accent marks are important for us. For our regular verbs, they're AR, ER, IR, only the vosotros form will get an accent. Okay, so if we're talking about a present tense verb and we're talking about one that's irregular, we are going to only have an accent in the vosotros form. Okay, so a trick for us is that if it is an AR verb, only the A part of the ending gets an accent. So you'll see here that we've got ice, right? And the A is the part that gets the accent. In ER verbs, it goes over the E part of the ending, okay, which gives us ace, and you'll see it's only over the E. And then IR verbs, it goes over the I part of the ending, ease. So if you can remember what vowel verb it is, so an AR, ER, or IR, it's going to go over that same vowel. So AR verbs, it's over the A. ER verbs, it's over the E. And IR verbs, it's over the I. Now, if you downloaded the ER/IR verbs notes, take some time to do those practice questions. Otherwise, have a great day.